Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, everybody. This week we are covering a very fascinating topic, from diary entries to digital screens, how beauty ideals and the sexualization of women have transformed over time. Over the past year, we've explored a web of interconnected topics: religious extremism, theology, the role of social media and radicalization, and most recently, body image and the impact of Fitspiration. And so these discussions aren't isolated. They all trace back to a common thread: how external influences shape our beliefs, behaviors, and sense of identity. Today, we're diving deep into that connection. We're going to look at how beauty standards, social media, and the normalization of self-objectification are part of a much larger cultural shift. The evolution of body image from calorie counting to the cult of fitness. So, our cultural obsession with body modification isn't new, it has just evolved. I recently read the book The Body Project by historian Joan Jacobs Broomberg, and it explores the history of American girls and how today women do have more freedom and choice than ever before, but many of us have begun a pattern of negative self-image, beauty obsession, and dieting as early as 5 or 6. And Broomberg states that all throughout history, adolescent self-consciousness has been quite persistent, but its level is raised and lowered, like the water in a pool, by the cultural and societal setting. For instance, in the late 19th century, girls might have been particularly self-conscious of their hands and feet due to the fashion and modesty standards of that time, as well as the emphasis on that delicate and proper presentation and the ideal feminine silhouette of the time, which was tightly laced corsets and those fluffy, puffy, big skirts, and that might have made girls more self-conscious of their waist and their overall body shape. And so while, in modern times, we may cringe at the confinements of what the Victorian society and wearing a corset must have done to women, but I'd like to argue that in 2025, today, body angst is driven by much more sinister forces. And what I mean is commercial interest utilize marketing strategies that result in enormous amounts of profit for the manufacturers of cosmetics, surgeries, hair products, and of course, diet foods. The reality that American girls now center their lives around their bodies is neither coincidental nor trivial. It reflects historical shifts that are now just being comprehended. So in the book, The Body Project, Broomberg examines how the modern fixation on weight began in the early 20th century. And historically, the surge of this explicit girl talk about body and sexuality is a relatively recent American phenomenon. As the language surrounding sex and the body has evolved, so too have the body projects of different generations of American girls. And so by the 1920s, girls began writing about their efforts to develop sexual allure through clothing and cosmetics. And for the first time, they experienced with slimming, a new body project tied to the scientific discovery of the calorie. These dieters and sexual players of the 1920s were generally girls that were middle to late adolescents, meaning they were finishing high school and headed off to college and headed off to jobs in the business world, unlike today, where such concerns are often affected much younger children and teenagers. So I want to fast forward to the 1970s and the 1980s. This is where we saw body control becoming much more than just being thin. It evolved into sculpting the ideal physique. And this shift gave rise to what we now recognize as the cult of fitness, and that's a movement that reframed body control as discipline and self-mastery. And this was the rise of bodybuilding, aerobics, and the emerging diet industry all played a huge role in selling the idea that with enough effort, anyone could build their dream body. The role of genetics in muscle growth and what fitness culture gets wrong. See, but science tells us a different story. While training and nutrition absolutely matter, genetics play a massive role in muscle development, strength, and even fat distribution. A study published in the Communications Biology in 2020 found that an individual's ability to build muscle and strength is 50 to 80% genetic. This means that two people following the exact same training program and nutrition plan will not achieve the same results, because their genetic blueprint largely determines their potential for muscle growth, recovery speed, tendon strength, and even motivation to train. Yes, fitness culture, including myself as a personal trainer for 20 years, rarely acknowledges this, and we've been pushing the narrative that extreme discipline alone is the key to achieving a certain look. This myth is not only misleading, but it is damaging, leading many people to believe that if they just work harder and ate cleaner or followed the right influencer's workout, they could look like a fitness model. And I have fallen for this too. I have not only perpetuated this myth, but I have fallen for this myth. So how does genetics impact strength and muscle development? Well, click the show notes for the episode blog if you want the nitty-gritty science breakdown. I'm just going to briefly talk about it here on the podcast. So we'll have muscle fiber composition, so fast twitch versus slow twitch factor. And so some folks might have more fast twitch dominant or slow twitch dominant, and that's going to determine whether they struggle with size gains but they're really fast in an endurance sports like long distance running. We also see myostatin, which is called the genetic muscle growth brake. And so it's a protein that regulates muscle growth by preventing muscles from getting too large. So folks might have a lower level of this, and that might help them have an easier time building muscles naturally, and that would give them an unfair advantage genetically. Couple other things here: testosterone and hormonal variability, and bone structure and muscle insertion. So that's like absolutely the aesthetic factor. So some people might just look naturally sculpted. They have different bone structure, like their rib cage width or their hip to waist ratio will dictate how much muscle mass is distributed, or muscle insertions. So that's like how long people's muscle bellies are, or they might have shorter insertions, making certain muscles appear smaller or less attractive. It's very interesting, and that's why it's so important to not even follow cookie cutter workouts, because your body shape, your femurs, how like long your leg bones are going to make or break if a squat or a lunge or certain movements are going to be more or less appropriate for you. And so the dangerous myth of hard work equals guaranteed results. So fitness influencers, personal trainers, and the entire no excuses fitness culture, they have sold this idea that discipline alone determines success. And yes, training consistency and proper nutrition absolutely matter, but they will never, ever override genetic limitations. And so this myth leads to unrealistic expectations. People are going to blame themselves when they don't achieve the Instagram-worthy physiques despite training and eating perfectly. Hello, that's what I'm going through. And I want to talk more about fitness in your midlife. Like fitness in your 40s is going to be way different than fitness in your 20s and 30s. And so I will continue to talk more about fitness in your midlife, eating and nutrition in your midlife. Those of us who are entering potentially perimenopause, menopause, hit me up in the DMs if you're interested in this sort of content. But anyways, back to the myth of hard work equals guaranteed results. So we'll see overtraining and injury, that no pain, no gain bullshit. Chasing unrealistic body standards will lead to many of us to overtrain, ignore recovery, and develop chronic injuries. That was my entire life in fitness. If you know me personally, you will know that I was always battling injuries and never actually felt good. I might have looked okay and looked like the ideal look, but I was never strong. Lastly, this myth will lead to disordered eating and supplement abuse. And some of us are going to resort to those extreme diet patterns, excessive protein intake, and even performance-enhancing drugs to push past genetic limits. And I will have to open up and be really vulnerable and share all the things that I did when I was doing my bodybuilding competitions. Now, it wasn't super extreme. Don't you dare think that I was doing steroids, but I definitely was influenced by the pressures. And even though I'm super natural, crunchy, hippie, I definitely gave into some of those pressures, and I'll talk about that at some point. The industry's selective silence on genetics. So why does fitness culture ignore genetics, do you think? Well, simple, it doesn't sell. If people accepted that their muscle building potential was largely predetermined, the billion-dollar fitness industry wouldn't be able to push expensive training programs promising X body in X weeks, supplement stacks claiming to maximize muscle growth, or the illusion that buying a program from a shredded influencer will make you look just like them. And ironically, many of these biggest names in fitness, especially those with extreme physiques, are either genetically gifted and often enhanced by PEDs, which are performance-enhancing drugs. Yet, they claim that their results come solely from hard work and dedication, keeping their followers trapped in a cycle of unrealistic expectations and self-blame. In nearly 20 years as a personal trainer, I wish I had been more honest about genetics with my clients. I mean, fitness is absolutely a combination of training, nutrition, recovery, and mindset, but genetics being the foundation that determines what's possible, I should have made sure that was crystal clear. We need to stop pretending that everyone can achieve the same results through sheer willpower. Fitness should be about maximizing your own individual potential, not chasing an impossible ideal. And so, as you know, I've talked about in previous episodes that focusing on body-neutral fitness and strength training has given me tangible, measurable improvements, but it's also made me realize how much misinformation circles in mainstream fitness spaces, particularly in the Fitspiration content flooding social media. So we talked a lot about fitness inspiration on a previous episode of this season, and I want to bring it back up because we're talking about how it's reinvented beauty standards. So in 2023, there was a study that looked at how fit ideal versus non-fit ideal body types, like fitness inspiration imagery, impacted us. So exposure to Fitspiration content significantly increased body dissatisfaction, especially in women who already struggle with self-image. Like, no duh, but this isn't surprising, and social media's curated highlight reels are going to create a distorted sense of actually what's truly achievable. And just like the 90s diet culture failed to acknowledge genetic differences in weight, today's fitness culture largely ignores the reality that strength and muscle growth are heavily influenced by genetics. And Fitspiration, this goes beyond body image. The same mechanisms that fuel fitness obsession, comparison, idealization, and self-objectification are also at play in this broader cultural shift towards hyper-sexualization. So let's talk about Fitspiration and self-objectification, the internal gaze. So self-objectification occurs when a person sees themselves through the eyes of others, measuring their worth by how they look rather than who they are. So good works versus good looks, that's been flipped on its head. It's now good looks versus good works. And nowhere in this dynamic is more evident than in the Fitspiration culture. John Berger describes this process perfectly in Ways of Seeing. A woman must continually watch herself. She is almost continually occupied by her own image of self. From earliest childhood, she has been taught and persuaded to survey herself continually, and so she becomes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as these two constituent, yet always distinct elements of her identity as a woman. Fitspiration content encourages this exact split identity. One part of a woman is the observer, constantly assessing whether she looks toned, lean, or strong enough. The other part is the observed, existing only as a reflection of an idealized body type. It's no longer just about fitness. It's about performing fitness for an audience. And the consequences are severe. We have chronic body surveillance, which leads to increased anxiety, depression, and disordered eating. And again, I have all the studies linked in the show notes episode blog. So we'll see an increase on focusing how movement feels. Women focus on how their bodies appear while exercising. And the lines between fitness and sexualization blur, which is where we're going to go later in the podcast, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body is only valuable when it's seen desirable to others. So in this way, Fitspiration isn't just about a rebranded version of diet culture. It's actually a pipeline to a broader cultural hypersexualization where the body is constantly on display, measured, and objectified. And this feeds directly into an even deeper issue: the normalization of pornography and the sex industry, where women's bodies are not just idealized, but commodified. By promoting self-objectification as empowerment, fitness inspiration culture primes women to see themselves as both the product and the consumer, caught in an endless cycle of external validation. And you know what the most insidious part is? It's framed as self-improvement, when in reality, it is just another system designed to keep women watching themselves instead of living fully. All right, let's dive into the connection between Fitspiration, porn culture, and self-objectification. The way women are impacted by pornography and by extension the sex industry is something far too many people overlook. And as you may know, you may not know, I have experience in the sex industry, and I want to speak more about my experience living in Portland, Oregon, but that's going to be for another podcast. Right now, I want to talk about these statistics that are staggering. So, the top 3 porn sites receive a combination of 134,491 visits per minute. Most pornographic videos contain some form of aggression or violence, particularly towards women, and a 2020 meta-analysis And remember from last week's episode, meta-analysis, which is going to be a overview, a bird's eye view of a lot more studies, will find that 88% of pornographic scenes contain physical aggression, which is slapping, choking, and hair pulling. Gross. And 49% contain verbal aggression, with women overwhelmingly being the targets. Most young people are exposed to pornography between the ages of 11 and 13, with some studies reporting even earlier age for boys. And another 2020 study found that 91.5% of men and 60.2% of women had watched porn in the last month. So how does Fitspiration connect to porn culture? Well, at first glance, you might say Fitspo, it seems like it has nothing to do with pornography or the sex industry. I mean, after all, isn't fitness about health and strength? But let's take a closer look because the connections become more clear. The first thing, both Fitspiration and porn culture promote self-objectification. So Fitspiration culture tells women that their worth is tied to their body's appearance, specifically whether they have lean, sculpted, and sexually desirable physique. This reinforces self-objectification, where women begin viewing their bodies primarily as objects to be judged, rather than lived in, experienced, and valued beyond aesthetics. Remember the study we mentioned that exposure to Fitspiration imagery will lead to increased body dissatisfaction and self-objectification, particularly among women who already struggle with issues with body image. So similarly, pornography will fuel external validation as a primary measure of self-worth. Women in both Fitspo and porn culture are expected to conform to an idealized version of femininity that is both hyper-sexualized and carefully curated for male consumption. Second, both industries capitalize on the illusion of empowerment. One of the biggest arguments in favor for Fitspiration and porn is that they both empower women. But empowerment in its truest sense involves autonomy, agency, and self-determination, not just adhering to societal beauty standards under the guise of strength or choice. Fitspiration content often presents extreme dieting, excessive exercise, and body sculpting as forms of self-discipline and self-improvement, even when they veer into disordered behaviors. I've lived and breathed this. The porn industry also promotes this idea that sex work is a path to empowerment, despite overwhelming evidence of the harm it causes to those involved. So research on the porn industry has found higher rates of PTSD, substance abuse, and coercion. So the same narrative that tells women they must be empowered by Fitspiration also tells them they must be empowered by commodifying their bodies through sex work. The reality is that both industries profit from women internalizing external standards of worth rather than defining it for themselves. And see, I have major beef with most progressives, especially in the deconstruction ex-Christian space. I saw how they were just advocating for porn and sex work, and it made me nauseous to my stomach. And even worse, that I had to self-censor my own experience being in the sex industry for almost 4 fucking years. You know what? When you're all about your gender identity and be like, you can't speak to things unless you experienced it, it's just so ironic how the left literally silences anybody and everybody who literally just rejects their ideology. Sex work is not real work. Sex work is not empowering. And that is a hill that I'm gonna fucking die on. That brings me to the rise of OnlyFans and the blending of fitness and sex work. So I've seen this myself with friends from the past. Social media is blurring the lines between fitness influencers and the sex industry. I saw this in Portland, Oregon. My friend organized a fitness class for strippers, and they even brought her on the news and glorified her. And I mean, at the time, and I still think it's relatively genius because she is making great money and the market is there because Portland, Oregon is sinister. But so we see platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and OnlyFans, they have just created this new category for influencers who want to monetize their appearance, whether that's just through fitness content or more sexually suggestive photos, videos, or outright pornography. And I've seen, like I mentioned, my friends, they'll have fitness influencing pages and also OnlyFans accounts. And so they're basically funneling their clients to either or. And this is like normalization of soft porn in the fitness space, suggestive poses, hyper-sexualized workout attire, and conditions that women are going to see their fitness journey as something that should be publicly displayed and then validated by others. And I've lived and breathed this. I've promoted this myself. I see a lot of myself in what I'm calling out and speaking, so I don't want to sound all high and mighty. I just really want to bring awareness to this and speak to, I think ideas have consequences and these ideas have bad consequences. So many young women have turned to selling that spicy content on OnlyFans as a form of income, believing it's harmless self-expression. Only many of us later to experience the psychological and social fallout. And so this isn't just theoretical, okay? Not only is it my anecdotal experience living and breathing, the growing body of research shows that women who engage in sexualized self-presentation online are reporting higher levels of body dissatisfaction and lower self-esteem. And that leads me to the psychological toll. I mean, what happens when women internalize these messages? It doesn't just impact body image. It affects mental health, cognitive performance, and even your physical performance. Studies have found that women who are primed to focus on their appearance are going to perform worse on cognitive tasks, experience greater body shame and anxiety, and are less likely to engage in activities that prioritize function over appearance. And this has real-world consequences. Women who internalize self-objectification are more likely to experience higher rates of depression and anxiety, greater susceptibility to eating disorders, and lower confidence in their physical abilities. So, we need to reframe the narrative. What is the alternative? Recognizing these patterns is definitely the first step in breaking free from them. If Fitspiration, porn culture, and social media all push the message that women must shape themselves into externally validated objects, then the antidote is reclaiming agency over our bodies. We're not things to be looked at, but we're living in these bodies for living, for experiencing, and creating. Also, reframing how we approach fitness. Strength training should be about what your body can do, not how it looks. Health and fitness should be prioritizing function over particular exercises. For example, barbell squats, like doing heavy barbell on my back is an exercise that does not work out particularly well for me. Push-ups, because I fractured my neck when I was 13. These sort of exercises I eliminate, and I'm prioritizing function over making sure I could brag about how much I squat or how many push-ups I do. There's also pressure, like because I'm a personal trainer, I should be able to hit certain standards. Does that make sense? Lastly, I want to say women should be encouraged to pursue movement, sport, and physical strength without that added layer of the performative reality of how we look and if we're sexually appealing. So the book, The Body Project by Joan Jacobs Broomberg, really got this started for me, this rabbit hole. And it reinforced how unprepared young women have been for the level of sexualization and the exploitation in our current culture. And it's something that has only worsened with social media. And the way that sex work is framed as empowerment in some circles ignores the long-term harm that it inflicts. And I have seen that firsthand. So I cannot wait to discuss more of this with my friend Salone Wilson, and she's a survivor advocate with the Exodus Cry nonprofit and podcast, and she's going to be on later this season. And her insights into the realities of the sex industry and sex trafficking and the dangers of normalizing self-objectification are incredibly important to continue this conversation. And that's all I have for you today, folks. So I hadn't planned this episode. I was actually just working on it as a blog, and there's a lot of things that I didn't talk about. I totally skipped the 1950s and 60s and how that culture was really obsessed with big boobs. I didn't talk about that at all. I didn't talk about a lot of things, but this podcast is already 20 minutes. So I just wanted to kind of hit the main points, add a little more context for the upcoming episode that's going to drop with my girl Salone. And I just want to hear your thoughts. I throw a lot of vulnerable stuff out there. I share a lot about my personal journey, and I'd love to hear from you, whether you want to find me on Instagram or Substack, or just reply to my email on tasteoftruth.com. I would really love to hear from you. Also, if you want to leave a 5-star review for the podcast, that would be the bee's knees. Greatly appreciated. To help get this out into larger audiences, send it to a friend. Share it. Tag me on Instagram. Tag me on social media. That is all very much appreciated. And as always, I want you to stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in. Have a great week.